The borders of countries are imaginary lines that are drawn in the dirt by politicians. They have always been that way and forever will be. As wars are won and lost, borders change and people living along those borders find themselves living in their ancestral homelands where their families have lived for centuries, but now they live under the tyranny of a new leader from a neighboring land. These changes in borders occurred many times over the course of the 19th century in Central and Northern Europe as Prussia and Otto von Bismarck embarked on their wars of German unification. Mr. Rief emigrated to the United States in 1864, and his census records show us he was identified by the United States government as being a German-born American. On the surface, this detail regarding one's origin is simple, but as we take a closer look back to the year 1870 and the pre-1870 records and the context surrounding those years, the identity of German-speaking immigrants to America becomes complex. In the 1870 Iowa State Census, Mr. Rief was listed as being from Germany. Mr. Rief's situation catches our historian eyes because Germany was not yet a country in the year 1870. Prior to 1870, there was no such thing as Germany as we know it today, but there was a German-speaking country called Prussia. The German nation-state was not yet unified, nor was it created until the 18th of January in 1871. So did the government officials of the United States filling out the Iowa State Census record in 1870 assume that Mr. Rief was of German origin because he spoke the German language? Or did Mr. Rief identify himself as being German in that census? Or is it a larger issue of combining similar people into a broader category of peoples and giving them a new, separate identity? How people identify themselves and others is important in every aspect of society. Identity is something that can include or exclude, but above all, identity is something that is complex and hard to define. Identity is a complicated subject because it has so many levels and can often be lost in history. We can compare the idea of identity with that of a shotgun shell. So, much like a shotgun shell, identity may appear to be a simple issue, but when it is completely unraveled, it is much more complicated than first anticipated. The point here is that identity is a complex matter, much more complex than simply placing individuals into rigid groups or categories, and many things need to be looked at and addressed when looking at one's identity. Since there are so many aspects going into identity, identity is not rigid like the steel of a farmer's plow, but rather it flows and can take many forms, such as the brewer's beer in our cups. Mr. Rief is an excellent example of all the complications that come along with identity. The Iowa State Census from 1880 gives us more insight to Mr. Rief's life as a German-speaking American. In the 1880 census, Mr. Rief was identified as being born in Germany, just like the census of 1870 showed us, but the difference here comes when looking at the broader picture. In the 1880 census, Mr. Rief's younger brother, Jorgen, was identified as being born in the German state of Schleswig-Holstein. Schleswig-Holstein is a combination of Danish duchies of Schleswig and Holstein after the Second Schleswig War fought between Denmark and Prussia in 1864. The book History of Potawatomi County, Iowa, which was published in 1904, gives us more information, and that is where we begin to see the complications regarding German-speaking immigration in the United States. In the county history, there are many biographies of important individuals throughout the county's history leading up to 1904, and luckily for us, Mr. Rief is mentioned. In the short biography of his life, we can confirm that he was, in fact, born in Schleswig-Holstein in the town of Erfta, just like his brother. But unlike his brother, he served for 9 months in the Danish army in 1862. A further explanation of Mr. Rief's situation comes in looking at the extent of the German language in Central and Northern Europe. The German language is very diverse and consists of many dialects, and one of those dialects stretches as far north as modern-day Denmark. The dialect of German is referred to as Plattdeutsch. Plattdeutsch is a dialect of the German language spoken throughout Northern Europe. With that being said, it is not hard to imagine the complexity of identity in Northern Europe during the 19th century along the borders of modern-day Denmark and Germany due to the extent of overlapping language dialects, culture and history. So did the Plattdeutsch-speaking people, like Mr. Rief, living on the borders of today's Denmark and Germany, consider themselves to be of German origin, of Danish origin, or neither? In Mr. Rief's case, the quick and easy answer would of course be German, because that's how he was identified in the Iowa State Census records. But with that knowledge that Mr. Rief served in the Danish army just before the Second Schleswig War, which was ultimately fought against the soon-to-become Germany, it is hard to decipher. So, did Mr. Rief align with the German nation-state or the Danish nation-state? In the census record, it shows that he aligned with the German nation-state, but his military alliance shows different. One thing we do know and can take away from this is that identity is not a rigid ideal and often is changed. Identity flows, and one's identity can take many forms and is much more complex than simply placing individuals into broader groups.